4.48 Psychosis is now performing at the new Diorama Theatre, which is not far from here. It's about 10 minutes walk. We received funding to make that performance from the Wellcome Trust, so we're very grateful to the Wellcome Trust for the funding and to set up different panels of discussions. We've had post-show question times, actually 4 of them, and 2 discussion panels and the symposium, all linked to the question on mental health and linked to the play that we have been playing, 4.48 Psychosis. Everybody can watch? Yes? Okay. What we're talking about is depression and mental health issues, and this play reflects that. After researching the subject, we understand that there's a greater proportion of deaf people affected by mental health issues, and it's linked to communication breakdown very often. And so we decided to set up this play. It's been a fabulous experience. You know, every evening we have sold out, and we have added 10 more seats at the front row, and even these have been sold out in a few hours. And we added then 4 extra slip seats, and they too have been sold out. So the show is completely sold, and it shows the great interest everybody has on mental health questions. And we have a fabulous panel today who are going to present on mental health issues. So the theme of the discussion and the presentation. So 4.48 Psychosis. Do we have a space that's safe to break the taboo? Because we don't talk much about mental health issues. If someone has a problem, we say, oh, you're fine, or we don't know to use the right words. And especially for men, which say, oh, men, they don't have mental health issues, do they? It's a taboo. And so we need a safe space to say it's okay to talk about it. It's okay to break the silence. So we have a very strict schedule. We have to leave the premises at 6 o'clock sharp. We have 5 speakers who will present, and then it will be followed by a question-answer session. And in terms of practicality, you will need to come and stand where I am standing. This so that our friend James Clark, who is deaf, blind, will be able to follow us and follow the signing of anyone who stands to speak there. The same goes for presenters or for those asking questions or making comments. Okay? So is everybody clear on that? So first of all, I'd like to introduce to you the first speaker, Dr. Jim Cromwell. The floor is yours.
Hello, thank you very much. Okay. So, is anybody going to keep time? Okay, I've got to be 20 minutes. Right. So I'll try not to sign too fast so that the interpreters don't fry their brains or fry their mouths to keep up with me. So what I'm talking from here in the lectern is the same that's coming up on the screen. So, as we said, my name is Jim. Why that's my name sign? Because I'm always in meetings bored with my feet in that position. The presentation is the space between us. So, for the play, 4.48 Psychosis, I feel it's about that space between illness and well-being. So deaf people, hearing people, doctors, patients, it's all those other things. Signing, speaking, there seems to be a gap between all those sets of people. In my view, there should be a bridge or how do we bridge between those two groups of people, is really communication. I can see most of you in the audience are agreeing with me. Please agree. So, I've been qualified as a doctor, as a psychologist, from 1997. So that means 10 years. I've worked with deaf adults, and then I moved over and did 10 more years working with deaf children, young people, families. So the adults, 10 years, most of the adults that I met, it was interesting to see that they're all around 40 or 50 years old, and they were living with their parents until the parents died off, and then they were left, and then they became mentally ill. So they had problems. It's interesting, it seems, where was the language that was, it used to be, it seems to be a lot of home sign going on, and there were problems around that. A lot of those people had many diagnoses. Quite a lot of them had been diagnosed with personality disorder. So personality disorder could be acquired from when they were young and they grew up with it. You can't catch it. It's something that you would have grown up with. So now looking at the children and young people in deaf schools. Of course, there are communication policies, but how you teach sign language, if it's oral education or sign language education, is unclear. So I've met a lot of young people, and with my research I've assessed young people, and what I've found is 75% of students have mental health problems in that school at that time. I don't know the general population, but the school I was researching in, it seemed to be a lot of children. 50% have declared they tried to hurt themselves. Of course, most of them were from hearing families. So that means there was a rarity of sign language happening in the home. But it's interesting that their parents, in my view, seemed that they had a poor attitude, that they thought it meant if their children were going to a deaf school, then it would be all right. They campaigned to make sure their deaf children went to a deaf school, so it seemed that their attitude was okay. So, what do we do? So, talking about newborn babies, they're tested very early, I think maybe 1 month, and that's when they're found to be deaf. But then what happens after that? Where do I point it? Okay. So I met somebody who was hearing and had a very good attitude, signed, and they adopted a deaf girl who was 1, I think she was 1 at the time. So they adopted the girl, and then 1 year later, people visited. Loads of people visited over that 1 year, and that was linked to CARE, the C-A-R-E. So 5 different people involved. And also there were 33 more visitors from 21, and with 21 other people from health, because it was a deaf child. And then 9 more people came, 29 people came, 18 more people from education. So all of that, all of those figures, in 1 year, there were 82 people knocking on the door professionals coming in, and 44 different faces during that 1 year. So from all of those people, there was only one deaf person. So it meant hearing parents had no idea about deafness. Lots of hearing people came through the door, explaining what the doctors would do, what they're going to look at, etc., etc. But there was nothing about deaf culture and signage. So, what do we do? How do we support people in this position? Language. Deaf children need to acquire language. From the start, they need to acquire language right from the very start. And how they do that is through the environment, through communicating with people, and then they fully acquire it. So they need that up to the age of about 5, where their little grey matter is sucking in all their information. After that, the grey matter is a little bit fixed. There will be problems after that to acquire anything more. So, of course, parents feel torn. Should I sign? Should I not? Should I speak? Can they hear me? And they're very torn and they don't know what to do. A lot of the professionals, psychologists, doctors, nurses, cochlear implant doctors, are all putting in their input. We've had a meeting today even, and half the team were talking about cochlear implants, and the other half were talking about mental health issues. It was nice and friendly, but there was an atmosphere there. There was a bit of conflict. So I've been putting up these, I'll put up some slides to show you some of my research. You don't have to read it all, you know, it's just my research. But, so from Europe, there's a few pieces of information about human rights that I'll just flick through. But it's just to show you, to give you a feeling of there's evidence out there around this topic. So it's not just, you know, a professional talking about it. It's been researched and it's been found. So this is from Europe. Later I'll put up the link, and you can, if you want to, you can download it all and read it for yourself. All the things in yellow. So this is interesting. It's talking about when a child is implanted, the professionals can't predict the future. They don't know whether it will work, whether it will fail. They don't know how it's going to be until the child grows up. And then it's too late. If it's failed, it's too late. Under 5, that's fine, but after 5, it's too late. So it's a really good paper to show that's the proof. Whether children should be implanted or not, it's still to do with language, and if it fails, they won't have access to that language. But they'd still have to provide sign language for those children before the age of 5. So this is repeating again, there's lots of information here. So this is important because there's loads of other papers talking about sign language, how important sign language is, cochlear implants, how that can affect children. But this paper is a government paper, and they've endorsed this, and they've said it's abuse, or they've given the definition of abuse. So it's talking about physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, blah, blah, blah. Well, there's 4 or 5 different abuses. And every time we go to a safeguarding course and safeguarding teaching, they put this list out and they give a definition of abuse and what it is. Emotional abuse. I'll sign this bit. persistent emotional maltreatment of a child, such as to cause severe and adverse effects on the child's emotional development. It may include not giving the child opportunities to express their views, deliberately silencing them. It may feature age or developmentally inappropriate expectations being imposed on children. These may include interactions that are beyond the child's developmental capability, as well as overprotection and limitation of exploration and learning, or preventing the child from participating in normal social interactions. So that seems to be the most important thing in my view. If you remember that, that'll be great. This is really important too. This is the rules from Europe. We're maybe going to Brexit soon, but these have been set up by Europe. So it's talking about sign language, culture, everything. And this is what we should be following. We should be following. So that's the link. All those papers are in this link. I think maybe Paula can send it out, maybe, if, you know, or you can take a photo of it, so that you can remember what it is. It's giving time for people to take a photo of you. If you need to. Yes, just in camera's being used. Okay. So I've talked about first language. What does that mean? So really, it means language first. Deaf people need language. From when they're born, they need input, they need language. If it's not there, what do? They grow up and it's too late. The important thing is to have a first language. I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure about that either. Possibly. Hearing people talk about those three terms, first language, the language that you acquired first. But most deaf people have hearing parents, so it means their first language is English, which is not very good. They kind of try and pick up what they can, but their first language is important. Mother tongue. That means the language that's passed on from parents, which is usually English, but again, the importance for deaf people is it doesn't suit them. It's being talked around them, but is that my mother tongue as a deaf person? I'm not sure. Preferred language? Maybe. Is it always relevant or important? Before, when I was in school, often staff would talk about that deaf persons, they prefer SSE, they prefer to speak with me, they prefer to lip read. Which is fine, but usually they prefer SSE with you because you can't sign very well and you do SSE to them. If somebody came in and signed BSL to them, they'd probably prefer BSL. So as a hearing person, me, if I went to France, I'd prefer French. I can't speak French, but I'd have a go. I'd try. So, preferred language? Yeah, I'm not so sure. It's sometimes helpful, sometimes not. Sometimes it's an excuse for hearing people to go, oh, okay, I can do a bit of talking and a bit of signing at the same time, and they'll get what I mean. But it's imposing that onto the deaf person. So for deaf children, if their hearing isn't very good, their eyes are usually great, and that's what they can pick up language from, their eyes. So their ears aren't very good, but their eyes are great. So all the papers before talk about eyes, visual language. what do we do? How do we help? In my view, it's to do with language. Deaf people have more mental health problems than hearing people because of language. So at the moment we're campaigning for BSL to become a GCSE, as is shown on the screen here. It was in the news reasonably recently. It's not been successful yet. There's more talking going on, a lot of talking going on, but it hasn't yet been agreed. So that needs to carry on. We need to continue that. In my view, primary schools should teach, when they're teaching about Egyptians and dinosaurs and all that kind of stuff, why are they learning that? You should teach them ABC, sign language. Just teach them basic sign language for all children. America have it. They learn ABCD like that, which is great. And if they have it, and it's fixed in their heads for later on, if ever they meet a deaf person later in life, they have that. They can pull out of their memory some fingerspelling that they learned when they were children. At least they could say hello to people. Second idea of mine is to teach BSL. Usually you go through this order: ABCs, sign for words, and then sign for apple. You spell apple A-P-P-L-E. Da 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 da. So then it goes down this kind of a list, but it's a bit meaningless. It's very slow. You know, it's okay that I've learned apple and I can say Switzerland and I can sign bus, but I can't have a conversation. So, in my view, I feel we need to go back and do it upside down. The first thing is to have confidence. You don't need the vocabulary per se. It's, you know, you can make stuff up. You can express yourself through miming and play acting. You just have to have the confidence. The grammar, maybe you can make up the vocabulary, but you can, if you have a topic, you can kind of make stuff up and work down that way. And then as you get really good, then you can get the specifics and you can have the vocabulary. But once you've drawn the picture, as it were, then you can come to the details. And the details are the letters and the words and the specific signs. That seems a better way around, in my view. So the last point. Do you remember I put this on earlier on? So of course, how do we sort this out? Involve the deaf community. We have to. We need more deaf professionals, more deaf people in the implant team, it's to show that hearing people, that they can't ignore deaf culture. We need deaf people in there. I'm really sorry, but we need deaf people to go swimming in that hearing world. I'm sorry, but that's I feel that's what we need. So thank you. Thank you for watching. I'm sorry if I've kind of given you lots of information really fast, but and people can ask me questions again.
Thank you, that was lovely. Thank you. Wow, this was actually powerful. What you said is so right. It's not just that it affects deaf children, it affects deaf people all through their lives, and we need a paradigm shift, and I agree with you, we need deaf people involved more. Thank you so much for such a lovely presentation, and I'm sure that many of you will have questions to ask afterwards. Now, our next speaker after Dr. Hamilton's speech, we'll have 5-minute break because we want to give Jean a break as well. She's been captioning and doing the speech to text all along.
Screw it. I'll just hold this one. First thing, I've jumped ahead in the queue because I have an 8-week-old baby at home, and my girlfriend said I could only come and talk if I went first and came home straight away. So I've got to run. I'm really sorry. The second thing is, could someone take a picture of me looking very professional next to the heading so that I can put it up at work so that they could justify me taking time off to come and talk to you. So there's a phone for that. I will strike my professional pose. Thank you. I do that every time I go and talk. So I wrote my talk last night rather quickly, and I've called it being a hearing psychiatrist with a silent capital D, because I describe myself as the hearing, which may be going into some of what Jim was talking about. Where's my clicker? So the reason for that is this working? No.
I'll do it from here.
Okay. Beep.
There we go.
Or being a DODA, which is another thing I made up, which is being a doctor of deaf adults. So I'm a consultant forensic psychiatrist who works with deaf people. I'm also a coder. So I think I'm the only coder consultant psychiatrist in the UK. What's happened there? And I work at the St Andrews Deaf Service in Northampton, which is a medium secure service, mainly for men, although we are getting some women occasionally who are deaf and have serious mental health problems and present a risk to other people. That's a very, very, very small group of people with mental health problems, but we do a lot to help them, and I'm going to fall off the stage. So if I nod, we'll do clicking. Go! So, I thought I'd talk about me as a coder, and then me as a doctor, and then how the two meet. So, I'm a coder. My dad's deaf. He's profoundly deaf. He went deaf at the age of 6 because of meningitis. He's a bit of an odd cookie in that productively he's very oral because he developed English, but his lip reading is absolutely appalling. So receptively he's best in BSL. So I grew up signing to him, but not receiving sign back, but I still spent my time in the Cambridge Deaf Clubs crawling around under the snooker table and playing with the other coders. My mum was a teacher of the deaf who went native and married a deaf person. So I grew up surrounded by deaf people. My first sign, and I still remember it, was that. Quicker. Or hurry up, because my mum sent me up to go and get my dad to come off the toilets to come downstairs. We used to do that a lot. We grew up mainly using SSE at home, me and my brother, but within the rest of the family. When I was about 11, our family was funded to go away on a residential to do our BSL stage 1 as it was then, which was really good and helped me develop my BSL. I then did my BSL level 2 once I was a junior doctor, which should be the next tricky bit. There we go. I really should have done my BSL level 3 by now, given that I sign every day of my life. But I'm too busy looking after deaf people at the moment, so I just don't have time, and having babies. So that's me as a coder. I suppose another thing about being a coder, it was incredibly normal for me growing up with deaf people. I think I was about 8 or 9 when I suddenly realised that other people's parents could hear them, or at least their fathers, and that seemed rather odd to me. So again, it gives me a nice understanding of deaf people just being people. They're not especially good, they're not especially anything. Deaf people cover the full range of society. And I think that helps me a lot as a doctor because it lets me, the deafness doesn't matter. It's hugely important, but it doesn't really colour my, ooh, this person's deaf, therefore they must do that, or they must do this, which I know a lot of other doctors have fallen into the trap of in the past. So, me as the doctor of deaf adults. I trained at Southampton Medical School, which is a fairly laid-back medical school. I went there because there was a heavy drinking culture. And I played a lot of rugby there. But I think probably the career-changing thing for me was when I was in my final year at medical school. I was on my psychiatry placement, and in the unit I was placed at was a deaf man who was profoundly manic. And this wasn't a deaf unit, this was a hearing unit, no one there could sign. They'd basically been locking him up because they could work out something wasn't right, but they hadn't done anything. So I went in as a coder and had a quick chat with him, and I think I was the first person who signed to its submission. And there were two things that struck me. One was that all of the signs I'd been trained for to look in people's mental state were coming through in his sign language, which was really interesting. So his sign language was incredibly fast, it wasn't particularly fluent, whereas I could tell that he could sign really well, and that was because he was so ill, he was bouncing around all over the place with topics. So that was really interesting intellectually, because it made me suddenly think, hang on, mental illness manifests differently in deaf people. But the other bit which really struck me was how horrible it was for him and how unfair it was that just because he was deaf, he'd been locked up, none of the staff had a clue what was going on, he didn't have a clue what was going on, and he wasn't getting the right treatment. So that made me realise that deaf people need special doctors. I said immediately that I thought he had bipolar and was manic, and they said, you're the student, what do you know? And then 2 weeks later they said, we think he's got bipolar and we think he's a bit manic. Which it turns out is how my life goes to this day. So that was a really important bit for me. I specialised in psychiatry in 2008, and as soon as I did that, I got in touch with Helen Miller, who some of you may know, who's the deaf consultant at Bluebell Ward. And I told her I was a coder, and she immediately said, you've got excellent pedigree, and then directed my career from that day on. So as soon as I got in touch with her, I wasn't going to be allowed to do anything but deaf psychiatry. As soon as I met her, I wasn't allowed to do anything but deaf psychiatry. She's quite a scary Glaswegian woman. I think she would have hurt me if I tried to drop out of deaf psychiatry. I subspecialised in forensic psychiatry in 2011, so that's dealing with mentally disordered offenders. Tiny, tiny specialty. But it's what I'm good at. And I spent a year at the National High Secure Deaf Service at Rampton Hospital, which is the only high secure deaf service in the world, which was a really, really good experience. I'm actually going to stand down here because then I'm not going to fall over every 2 minutes. So that was my background as a trainee. I qualified as a consultant in 2014, and as soon as I qualified, I went to St Andrews and took over their deaf service. And I've been working there since. So this is my 4th year of being a deaf specialist. And I really, really enjoy it. So why would anybody be a deaf psychiatrist? The reason I do it is because I can do it, and as that first person I met who was deaf and mentally ill showed me, deaf people need doctors who understand deafness and understand mental illness. I'm a doctor, I understand deafness, therefore I've got a duty to the deaf people of the country to combine those two. Not everybody can do that. Not everybody has my background in deafness, as bizarre as that may seem to me, and not everybody is a consultant psychiatrist. Secondly, well, this is the bit, deaf people need really good doctors. Actually, deaf psychiatry is really hard, but we'll come on to that a bit later. If anything, deaf people need better doctors than hearing people. You can bluff a lot with hearing patients. It's a lot harder with deaf patients. I like to think I'm a good doctor. But the last bit is because I love working with deaf people, deaf professionals, as well as deaf patients. About half our staff at Northampton are deaf, which is awesome. And I know it's so important having deaf staff with deaf people. Going back to what Jim was saying about hearing staff in cochlear implant teams, my deaf patients have had a whole life of hearing people telling them what to do and doing things to them. Therefore, if I tell them you need to take these pills to make your mental illness better, it just becomes another hearing person telling them yet another thing. And perhaps I'm just doing it because they're deaf and I'm hearing, so I think they're stupid. Whereas if my deaf social worker, who is a pure BSL user, has a sit down with them and explains you need to take the medication, it's going to be the best way to manage it, that's nothing to do with their deafness. And that's what I mean about taking the deafness out of the whole problem. Also, for me, working in BSL is like coming home. So it's very nice and I feel very comfortable doing it, which goes back to my preferred language. The challenges for doctors with deaf patients, and it's both big D and little d deaf patients. This is almost where I give the excuses for my peers who are not deaf specialists for when they screw up. Diagnosing a person's mental health problems is incredibly hard unless you understand their cultural background. In a deaf person, that means you have to understand deafness. Risk assessment, which is a huge part of what psychiatrists do, that's assessing how likely it is that someone's going to harm themselves, harm someone else, get into difficulty, whatever, and how we mitigate that, is really difficult unless you understand someone's cultural background and their deafness. Communication, which in psychiatry is everything we do, is very difficult unless you can sign and can understand deafness. I use interpreters when I'm working, mainly because I don't have 4 hands and I need to take notes. I can't write and sign at the same time. But that does mean that I can watch as somebody's talking to me, even if I'm using the interpreter, I can see what their sign language is doing. I can see their sign language beginning to break down because they're really, really psychotic. I can see their signing getting really small because they're finding a subject really difficult. Because I know sign language. If I couldn't use BSL, I'd be entirely dependent on the interpreter. And what often happens is the doctor ends up interviewing the interpreter. And sometimes I'm sure the interpreter have their own mental health problems, and that's a really helpful intervention for the interpreter, but it doesn't necessarily help the deaf person. And then the final point of this is, treating mental illness is incredibly difficult if you have the wrong diagnosis, the wrong risk assessment, you can't communicate with your patient. How on earth do you get things right? And I think that's why so many deaf people get a really raw deal with mainstream mental health problems. It's incredibly hard if you don't understand deafness and you don't understand sign language. And that's why we have specialists like me. But you need to get the patients to me, which is a problem. So my experiences of working with deaf patients are that errors with diagnosis and risk assessment by people who are not deaf specialists are the story of my life. I've lost count of the number of times where I've gone along to a situation where there is a deaf person who is clearly in distress and everybody can see they're in distress, but no one really knows what's going on. The hearing psychiatrist says, well, we don't think there's anything wrong with them, we think they're just a bit deaf. And I asked them about 3 questions, and it turns out that aliens are breathing secret messages into their brain. And it's actually because they're really psychotic. And no one's actually even bothered to ask them that, because they've just put it down to the deafness. Equally, I've had other patients who've been diagnosed with learning disabilities with all sorts of things, with no actual evidence for that. I had one patient who was diagnosed with a moderate learning disability, who clearly didn't, he was just a normal deaf person. But when we dug into it, we found out it was because his council had merged the sensory social services team with the learning disability social services team. So then, because he'd been under the deaf social worker, and now they were all one team, he must have an LD. So he was then given a moderate learning disability diagnosis and placed in supported accommodation and all sorts of things. Wasn't the problem. Risk assessment equally, I've had very, very sensible doctors make really stupid risk decisions because the deafness confuses them. I've known a very sensible consultant forensic psychiatrist tell me that someone who was very, very, very criminal was now no longer a risk to anyone because they'd lost their hearing. And I did explain, well, actually, they hurt people when they were hearing, and they still hurt people now. Common things. He understands more than he lets on. The general answer I give back to people who say that to me is no, he doesn't. He lip reads very well. My answer back is no one lip reads very well. We communicate through writing notes. You think you're communicating through writing notes. And this kind of goes back to what Jim was saying about SSE being a preferred because the person signing to you can only do SSE. Deaf people have spent so long trying to manage in a hearing world that you're very adaptable. And I don't think hearing people necessarily realise when you're being adaptable to meet their needs rather than what you actually need. I've found that when deaf people get into specialist deaf mental health services, they suddenly flourish. They get a diagnosis which actually makes sense. They get the treatment they need in a form they can understand it. Suddenly they can get through their mental health problems and suddenly they can get on with their lives. The big problem is getting them into that service, and I spend a lot of my life having ridiculous fights with commissioners, and in fairness, the commissioners want to get the services, but the way the structures are set up in the NHS and funding make it incredibly difficult. One of the big problems is that deaf people have to go through hearing services to get referred to specialist deaf services, which means you have to go through the problem to get to the solution to that problem. Us in deaf services are the solution to the problem that hearing services can't deal with mental health of deaf people, but we can only get a referral if it comes from a hearing service, who we know can't do it. They try, but it's really, really hard, and I spend a lot of time just smacking my head against walls. Something which I think is really important is all deaf people face huge barriers to appropriate treatment. And I think that's because big D deaf people who are sign language users, for the majority of hearing doctors, it is so alien to them that they recognise they can't do it. People who are lip reading, or whose first language is English, it's not very alien. It feels like just another hearing person. But actually, the challenges that that deaf person faces in terms of understanding of the world, getting on in the world, understanding therapy, understanding everything else, are to a degree the same. They're similar, at least, to big D deaf people. And I think these are the people who get the worst deal, because they're the ones who really end up in mainstream services doing badly. The final really positive bit is, from my time as a doctor, I've been to India to talk about deaf psychiatry. I do all sorts of things around the world. And UK deaf mental health services, because of our history in mental health and deafness, are some of the best in the world. That doesn't mean they're great, but they're a hell of a lot better than anywhere else, which is really, really good. Thank you. I'm afraid I have to go, because I need to go and do bedtime.
Thank you for your time, Alex. Paula says, oh wow, that was amazing, and one of the best in the UK and in the world. Wow. Okay, let's have a 5-minute break for Jane, so if you need to go to the loo or just have a quick chat for 5 minutes. Let's see the time now, and at what time we come back. It's 4:48. So come back at 58. This is like another plane. Okay, we are going to start soon.
Just wait for people to come back in the room. People disappeared outside for chat, so no, I think they disappeared, properly disappeared. to 5, we still got an hour. And then it's like, oh, I've got an hour. Should we start? We ready? Okay. Welcome to Dr. Sarah Powell. Will you introduce yourself, please? Hello, everybody. My name is Sarah Powell. So that's my surname because of my last name, Powell. I'm a psychologist. I work in Psy Health. I've worked there for many years. Early on, I think it's very important for people in the audience, professionals, family members, friends. I think it's very important to talk about this topic. Linked a little bit to what Paula was saying about this being a safe space and breaking the taboo. Breaking that taboo is very important for the deaf community for 2 main reasons. So I'm sure a lot of you know sign language. If you're hearing and deaf, the differences between. For hearing people out there, they have sign language. 25% of that hearing population. Statistics show, I'm sorry, I messed up. 25% of hearing people have experienced mental health issues, and from the deaf, it's 1 in 2 have experienced mental health problems. So 46%. So it's very interesting. We talk about talking, not sign language. So it's definitely deaf people are more vulnerable to develop mental health issues. Alex talked earlier on, so there's a link there. So he's got more experience in mental health. They've got more experience in mental health. So Jim was talking about as deaf children grow up, and they can have those mental health issues from when they're growing up. So it's all from education, from families. So it's already starting as they're young, growing up, and then it can get worse and worse as they grow up. It's self-management, how they're managing their mental health issues, all of those problems as they get older get worse. In Sign Health, we're committed to the stigma, the labelling that is out there for mental health. People go, oh my God, the mental health problems. But because people don't understand what it is, they don't understand people's problems, they don't understand what it's like. So we need to take those stigmas away. Excuse me. We need to show that it's all right to have mental health issues. I mean, it's not right, but it's all right. It's all right to be not okay. So it's acceptable. You can have a bad day, you can be a bit stressed, you can be a bit depressed. That's okay, but we do need to talk about that. There's lots of barriers, and people before have talked about these barriers. As children grow up, education, economic factors, because most deaf people, as they grow up, have bad education, poor education, so that impacts on their future careers, future work, and then they maybe go on to benefits, or they're unemployed, or it's difficult for them to get promotions. It's a challenge to go to university because of funding, who's paying for the interpreters. There's so many barriers everywhere. So that has a major effect on people's well-being. Communication, for hearing people it's fine, it's easy. And as we were saying before, if a mother, the mother tongue, and if people are, parents are passing on the same language, that's fine. But if there's another language involved, sign language involved, then it will affect people. So it's the culture is within that as well. So that's not passed on necessarily very well to deaf children born to hearing families. So communication has a major impact. So it's sometimes very difficult for deaf people to understand emotions, to understand what's happening to them, what's happening out there. It's difficult to understand the words that are being used. I feel low, but how do I say that? I can express if I'm hurt physically, But how do I talk about that if it's not a physical hurt? Education is difficult for a deaf person growing up. I'm sure that's the same with lots of people, lots of you out there have difficult experiences at school, teachers telling you off, not actually understanding it, being unallowed to sign, having to go through speech therapy, being forced to speak. It's a waste of education in a way. How do people develop those bonds between each other and an adult and a child, a teacher and a child? It's really difficult and has a great impact. So that it's a form of abuse, and it's higher within the deaf than hearing people, and that explains the impact. So how do I know if there's something wrong with me? Where do I go? I suffer, I experience these things, but I have a problem as to where to go to have to find help. So I said there's an impact from education and lack of employment and economic lower income. So it's rare for deaf people to be born to deaf parents. Most people are born to hearing parents, and therefore I'm not surprised at the higher level of mental health issues with deaf people. But if I look out there, there's a lot of people who've experienced it, deaf people in the deaf world, but it hasn't happened. People don't talk about it in the deaf world. But why is that stopped? What's stopping them from talking? So one is recognizing mental health. Information about anxiety, panic attacks, phobias, depression. Where do you find that information in sign language? There's not much out there. Sign Health, we have a lot on our website, but other organisations putting things out there in sign language about depression and anxiety, there is not much out there. So far there's around 15 signed videos, 15. But for hearing people with speech, there's over 900 self-help materials. So people know how to get their information. They can get that information. For example, psychosis. Have people looked into that, into psychosis? I found one example. It's a 4-minute clip, and that's it. And it's there. That's amazing. Information for hearing people, there's stacks and stacks of it. But information in sign language, there's one 4-minute clip. So really we need to get down to developing some more so that deaf people who experience mental health can identify it, identify what they have, whether that's depression, anxiety, or psychosis, or whatever. But they haven't got access to information in order to do that. In the world, with our world knowledge, that's also lacking. Because again, that's access to information. How do deaf people do that? Hearing people do it on Facebook, on radio, on Twitter, on anything else. But so far, for deaf people, there's not an awful lot. So again, we have to encourage more. We have to talk about it. Tomorrow, it's the World Mental Health Day. Did you know that? See, there's a lot of information out there in English, in written English, but for the deaf community, it's not much. There's barriers all the time. So one thing that's interesting for me, of course I'm deaf, I've grown up deaf, I didn't know anything about it until I had my hearing children. And then in a queue at the post office, my son tapped my leg and he said, "There's a person talking about a murder." I was like, "I didn't know that. Where did you get that from?" And he heard it, overheard it. And then I realised, even standing in a queue, hearing people can overhear conversations and learn things. So whether that is mental health or depression or breakdown or whatever, people are hearing those terms and hearing those conversations, so getting information and knowledge. But how do deaf people do that? It's people are isolated. They stay at home. They don't talk to people. They don't talk about things like that. I'm not going out. I'm going to stay at home. But they don't wonder why people don't come and visit. Because they're depressed, people don't visit, and then they get worse, and it's that whole cycle. So maybe that's why deaf people don't talk about it. Maybe they don't know how to identify it within themselves. So, as it mental health, you need help, but that's another barrier. So it's really difficult for deaf people to get access to therapies. Hearing people, it's fine, but there are barriers at the doctor, at the GP, because at the GP you need an interpreter. But how, if you rely on writing things down, how do you explain that? That's really difficult. Easy for physical symptoms, you can show it, but to talk about a mental health problem, how would you do that through written notes, backwards and forwards to a doctor? And after that, it just gets worse and worse, until it gets to a crisis level. So crisis service, it's usually a phone-based service. But how will deaf people, or text messages, but how will deaf people access that? How would you get access to the community mental health team? It's difficult. There are some little pockets of services, but nationally, it's not there. So sometimes the mental health problem starts very small, but by the time it's dealt with, it's grown and grown, got worse and worse, and then it's become a crisis. It needs to be early intervention and early support. That's really important. Alex was talking about his service and saying that a deaf person has to go to a hearing service first to get referred. I'm not saying that's wrong, but it's a barrier. To make somebody go to a mainstream service first and go with an interpreter, you know how difficult that is to talk about depression or anxiety to another person in the room as a three-way conversation. Most people give up and then the depression gets worse. But to go to a hearing service, it's not good enough for a deaf person. They need to be expressing themselves in BSL. So they need to be referred to a deaf service, a deaf psychologist, where they can sign. I mean, if they want to speak or use an oral method, that's fine, but to be able to use their sign language. But there are only few. It should be the other way around. It should be lots and lots of first stop provision people can access through BSL. It was only established in 2011. The tertiary service in Denmark. And then Bluebell Ward and and Springfield. There's 3 units. But what about before that? What about earlier on, before that, just to get the diagnosis? Sign Health has set something up, but over the years it's taken all that time to actually set something up. So we're talking about barriers to access. This is a perfect example. On that right-hand side is deaf people carrying a burden of all the barriers and all the problems and all the lack of access. Because they've been fighting to get that access and knock down those barriers. But for the hearing, there's no problems. They go straight through. You can see the size of the doorways. The deaf are waiting and waiting and waiting before they can get help, and the hearing can go in and out. It should be the other way around. The deaf should be able to be identified really easily and get their service in place so they can talk, so they can communicate in sign language, so they can get the help, they can go to the doctor, or they can self-refer. So really, it's really important when a diagnosis is made that they get help straight away and not have to wait such a long time. So people don't understand how mental health support, what the mental health support is out there. It's like step 2, step 3, step 4, all steps are come. So step 1 is early diagnosis, early identification of what the problem is, if it's depression or anxiety or whatever. It's trying to identify that. Step 2 is simple therapies. learning how to deal with it, just in short sessions. If it doesn't work, then that goes to step 3. So more therapies, more intense. So if it doesn't work, then they go to step 4, and then specialist services, more one-to-one sessions, and if that doesn't work, and then there's tertiary service within that as well. That's what it should be like. But for many people who can't talk about it, they miss out the steps 2, 3, 4. So why is Sign Health so people need to get help through Sign Health, through sign language. So some people have real difficulty with psychologists. They don't want to go to their GPs. They want to sort it out. They know there's problems with communication, with interpreters and all that kind of stuff. So they know that, so they self-refer to us. IAPT, that's a government-recognised mental health service, but you can wait a long time for that. So that's being changed. So it means there's a shorter time to get treatment. So access to nurses who can deal with their problems and get success rate rather than having to wait an awful long time. So we comply with the national standard. So we comply with the NICE recommended treatment routes. So if it's depression, we do this, this and this. If it's anxiety, we do this, this and this. If it's panic attacks, we do this, this, this. We don't go off on tangents, we go through the recognised procedure. And we've got special training in order to do that. So it's been working very well, and we're the only service that does this. So we put information on our Facebook, and it's very important that information is continually posted, brief, sign videos that people can watch. So it gives the symptoms for depression, so people can self-identify. So we've had 100 and something views already. So 1.5,000. So not everybody accesses through Facebook. So those isolated people who are thinking about it or not getting that information, it's really important that the information reaches them as well. Information on well-being is important too. So we've got those 15 clips. So it's worth, if you have depression, to have a look at those and learn from them. If you're having panic attacks, to learn from that. If there's domestic abuse, all that kind of stuff. It's very useful information, so I advise you to have a look. It's free. So for deaf people, no, it's not good for deaf people to have to pay. Doctors or whatever give us a proportion of their money in order to pay for the service. So if people think they have to pay, that's not good enough. It's a paid for service, so it's free for people coming to us. So like I was saying, it's breaking that taboo. It's very important. And we know there are barriers to access therapies, to self-identification. People shouldn't keep it to themselves. You need to talk. You need to be signposted to places. Find somebody to talk to and to know you're not on your own. It's very important to understand that there is help out there.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Sarah, for this amazing presentation. And let's break the taboo and not keep it in, but let it out. Now I'd like to invite James Clark to come and make his presentation. So my name is James Clark, with an E at the end, and that's my name sign. I'm deaf and I have Usher. I'm not a professional, unlike everybody else who spoke before me, as doctors and researchers, scientists and all that. I'm just an independent guy, and I just wanted to share with you my experience. I'm fairly confident speaking in public because I have spoken before at different conferences about what it is like to be deaf with Usher. But today is a little bit different for me. Thank you for inviting me, but I must say I'm a little bit nervous here because the subject is slightly different. Right. Here you see the time, and this is the oven that we're going to warm up. Something's cooking. Right, I come here with my bag of shopping, and I want to have a taste of different cuisine. Some that I don't know and some that I know already. What Sarah explained was interesting, and what I want to share with you is some food for thought. What year are we this year? 2018. Great. Where are we here? Are we in a small village outside in Scotland, or where are we here? We are in London. 2018, London. Are we in a developed country? Yeah, I see people nodding. Okay, great. Is the technology advanced in this country? Yes, pretty much so. Right. I'm very nervous. I would say that 2018 is perhaps not exactly a bad year, but I want to perhaps be able to forget about 2018. And there is a suggestion by Sarah to sign it as forget with a thumb up 2018. Sometimes we associate the sign mental health with problem. But at the end of the day, we want mental health. We want mental well-being. We want all to be good. So let's look into my shopping bag, because I've been shopping in different places and I've received lots of different foods. Talk to us, says this card. Right. Here's one food for thought. It's cooking. 2 minutes so far. That card that I have received is from the British Transport Police, and it tells me how to contact them. Text, email, website, and telephone. I don't feel confident. My first language is BSL. So I go shopping in my shopping bag, and I'd like a beer. I love a good beer. And here is a beer mat. You feel low? Don't drink. There's someone out there you can talk to. Okay? This is the message number 2, to spice up the food. And you can text, email, call, go on the website. And here I am with my sign language, not sure I can contact them. Let's see what else in my shopping bag. There's a charcoal. Mine. Right, there's a lot of English in there. Stirring it in. It's cooking, but I need more. I want the taste to be really strong, and I want some good help for that. This is a leaflet from my local authority, my local council. and you can see that it's black and white, completely depressing. I don't want anyone to start reading it. It looks like salt. I'll just add it into this stew. And now this leaflet is people considering suicide. Herbert taught me to sign, considering suicide rather than saying or thinking of dying or thinking of death. There's plenty of information, but there again you can email, call, go on the website. I'm adding this to the food. Another leaflet here that I add as another ingredient, where I just give a telephone number, an email, and a website. Here's a support line. And I feel same old, same old. Long lists of names and telephone number. It's all in English. Okay, I'll add it to the salesman. Okay, I want something big in my shopping bag. This is the CHMT, Community Mental Health Team. Quite wordy, lots of team. Okay, I'll add it to the cooking. And there is telephone numbers, email address, website again. And finally, a really big service with a beautiful brochure. Looks new, from the British Transport Police. Where to go when you need help, when you need support. Again, we see list of name of the support team and how to contact them. And again, we get a telephone number, an email, and a website. And I'm stirring this all in. And I'll let you have a taste of that. Where is the deaf taste? There's none. It doesn't taste deaf at all. There's absolutely nothing for deaf people. So we need to go back. Earlier this year, just checking the time. Don't go so fast. Earlier this year, I knew support was out there. I knew my family was there and my friends were there. But in that panoply of support, earlier this year, and I have mentioned it on Facebook, I will explain about something I have done. I was standing on the platform in a station, at the very edge of the platform. And I wanted attention. I wanted help. Because when I went to the GP, they were just pointing everywhere and nowhere, and it didn't help. I went to another service and got no service. I wanted to be referred directly to a sign language deaf mental health service, and I wanted to really give a slap in the face of all these services that were driving me nowhere. And so I had planned to go to the station for the last train service, and it was after 12 o'clock at night. The train was arriving and stopped, and I don't know how. The person driving the train phoned up, and 5 people approached me when I was standing there at the edge of the platform. And I was transferred to a mental health hospital, and the treatment there was awful. Their behavior, their attitude was awful. To give you an example, the doctor was just saying, "Sit down." And I said, "I need to see you." And then the doctor looked quite angry, and I tried to stay calm. I was sent home, but I mean, all in all, it happened 3 times where I've been given this piece of information. I have a whole pack at home of leaflet of we can help you, support line, but actually there is no information from me to contact a deaf service. So later perhaps someone can explain to me, because my big question is, as a deaf BSO user, we're in London, in a developed country where technology is fine and we're all good in 2018. Where are services for deaf people? So we can just ditch that stew I just made, and I just thought I'd give you that information from a service user experience. Yeah, you can read that. Thank you, James, for being open about your experience. It's so important to share experience. If you think your friend or someone you know is going through a rough time, take the time to be with them so they can just tell you what's going on. We have question time afterwards, but we have one more speaker before the question time. And I'm sure that you're all burning to come and comment and ask questions. So now the next presenter is Hannah Wally. We'll have a short break, but please don't leave the room because it's going to be an extremely short break. Now over to Hannah Wally.
You guys okay, Jane? Hello, my name is Hannah. I'm the last person. I'm quite nervous now. Everybody's been going through announcing me. So just to say who I am, I'm a qualified mental health nurse. Only for deaf people, not only for deaf people, but generally, but my experience is working in an inpatient service in London, in the southwest. So I'm here, I was asked to come here. Thank you very much. Very honoured to be here. So really, we're talking about the taboo, breaking the taboo. Because I was asked what I see as the future, what the development's going to be in the next 20 years from a nurse's perspective, because I'm working in the community, so I'm working in the medical world, but I'm kind of out with the community as well and meeting deaf patients, deaf people. So I want the government to listen to people, deaf people who are suffering mental health issues, to listen to them. But how? Who is there? Sometimes people ask me, who do I talk to? Who's the right person? But I'm not sure if they are the right person to talk to. I can recommend people, but I'm not sure if that's the right person to recommend. There are other 2 qualified mental health nurses, and I talk to them, and we agree topics, and the most common one that comes out, accessibility comes out at number 1. But accessibility has all these other little subshoots coming off. So education, deaf leadership, technology, and self-care, and aftercare. And we feel in the next 20 years, we expect some changes to happen, because now we're in the 21st century, like James was saying, we're in the 21st century, come on, we need to get going. So accessibility. I've read one paper only last year that was on the internet, and it was called JCPMH, which shows the commissioners about how to encourage deaf accessibility to mental health services, information, communication, and it's like a guideline. And I was staggered. It's really in-depth, detailed information, and really empowering. Like Sarah Powell was saying, it's really detailed. So there's 30 pages of really clear information, what we need to do, which is great. and it talks about language barriers. There are so many language barriers. Communication, BSN interpreters who don't come. You book somebody and then the appointments are delayed or cancelled, and there's frustration that gets more and more and worse and worse. And also doctors understanding deafness, deaf culture, deaf linguistics, people's upbringings, their emotions, there's problems that may be linked to their upbringing, linked to their mental health issues. There's so much research that's happened, but in assessments and the questions that are asked, how that matches to a deaf person is questionable. How do deaf people access the right assessments, and how those results are accurate and relevant? The fact that you can't self-refer, you have to go to a GP and suffer all the barriers that involves before you can get to a psychologist, or if you're pushed towards a psychologist and that's not the right psychologist for you and they're not using sign language, that's another barrier. I know deaf people like to talk, hearing deaf people doesn't matter, people like to talk, but what's the solution? We have to think about things, how we solve things. It would be nice to have some solution put out there. We need a clear care pathway. So if I talk to a friend, how do I get a clear path towards a solution? There's so many dead ends that people have to go through, which can become quite a negative experience before you find the right path. And I know somebody else who maybe is on that same path with me, but we need clear information, clear signposting. To have a BSL interpreter is great. I'm not criticising interpreters, but it's not the best. To be booked to see somebody and to have an interpreter, then I've got to wait 6 weeks because I have to wait for an interpreter to be booked. A hearing person could maybe get an appointment the next week quite quickly, but deaf people have to wait, and then they go up to that appointment, and then the interpreter is not there for whatever reason, and then the appointment's delayed, and which provides another barrier, of course. I can't see what's underneath that because of the. There we go. So talking about the commissioners and the JCPMH, it's the guidelines. It has 12 principles. It's wonderful to read. It's great. It's like an ideal world. It's beautiful, ideal world. It's these 12 principles, and they're all there. But does that actually happen? So it's great to show that to the commissioners, and I feel we need to reinforce that and keep showing them. If you want to know what your rights are, or the Equalities Act, it's there, you can read it. I know it's a lot of reading, but it's there. So if we're talking about education, lots of deaf people with mental health issues get misdiagnosed. Or people go, oh, there's nothing wrong with them, oh, they just can't hear properly, oh, they're all right. Because doctors are not aware, they don't understand the culture, the linguistics, the communication, the needs, the skills that are there, they don't know. So there needs to be education, that's really important. So doctors, GPs, any medical related people, they need educating. And I think you were talking about before, when people are little, when children are born, they're diagnosed as deaf, and then given to hearing parents saying, oh, I'm so sorry, you have a deaf baby. But they say sorry, it's like a negative already. They're focusing on that ear thing already. There's a problem, it's damaged, they're being audised. They already talk about hearing aids, cochlear implants to fix it. So it's not really the hearing parents' fault. They go, oh, because they've been told, sorry, it's damaged in some way. And then the parents go, oh, I've got a damaged baby. So they are already talking about trying to cure them and mend them. So how do they get the bond between themselves, the parent and the baby? So 90% of deaf children are born to hearing parents. So that means hearing parents are different from their children. And I can imagine hearing parents are quite nervous and won't listen to anybody who's telling them information. Whether it's right or wrong, it doesn't matter. It's like somebody else knows best. The doctors will know best. So deaf children at school, as children grow up, there's a lot of miscommunication. So they grow up and parents value their school, because if they go to a deaf school and there's a teacher of the deaf, and there's a role model for them, and that's valued. But that's a time that they're trying to be changed, they're trying to be repaired, which is a limited time. But again, if they're in mainstream, where's the repairing done? So deaf awareness as well, I know that's quite complicated, but it's important to teach. There's no solution for that. I have a solution for that. So it should be mandatory, regularly practiced for mental health professionals or medical professionals, GPs. They should have mandatory training linked to deaf awareness regularly. I've been training deaf awareness and it's lovely, but once in a while they have it, but it's like a 2-hour session. But they have 7 years to study to be a doctor and they get 2 hours of deaf awareness. That's it. So is that really awareness? Is that really enough knowledge? Because I'm sure they will get lots of deaf patients coming to them, and there's deaf blind people coming to them, and blind people coming to them, and there's so many variations and so many challenges, but one of those challenges is meeting a deaf patient and knowing how to deal with them. Parents of deaf children need a system. So once the baby is identified, that shouldn't be a problem. And then what do we do? There's options, a range of options, not just the medical option. We should have the social model being used, the deaf culture, going to the deaf club, signing. There's lots of options that should be offered rather than this limited medical option. There should be support given to parents. I feel it's important, not recently, but I'm still young. When I was at school, there was a PSHU, psychosocial health and education, whatever subject being taught. So where do babies come from and how basic learning how you get on in the world. So it's useful to include within that something about mental health, especially for deaf people, because we miss out on a lot of information. Like you were talking about, standing in a queue and your son overhearing a conversation. We miss out on so much, and I feel that will be very useful to raise in deaf education. So people are more aware of signpostings in different places. Because it happens at a young age, and then later on you have that information already, so you know where you can go, rather than panicking and then it becoming too late. I've got to sign fast, deaf-led. So we need more deaf leaders, deaf people at the front. There are deaf people out there. We're working the people here, but people need to be at the front line. So more advocacy, more involved. Like I say, visibility. I'm deaf. I need to be in work and be visible so I can go out and give talks to show people their role models, peer support, talking about, last week there was a panel we were talking about no male deaf people on the panel, and talking about support groups, and feeling there were barriers to that. Men wanting to talk with men. Those who are suicidal. And then planning strategies. So rather than bringing it in at the last minute, bringing it in early on, starting to discuss things earlier, having people contribute their ideas, thinking about the future, so we can plan and create strategies, including deaf issues. So this is the 21st century, as we said. It's the digital age. So that means we're all relying on our mobile phones. You see everybody on a phone. You know, you're at home and the first thing you do is switch on the TV. Everything is technology. You know, use Google all the time. There's a useful advantage to this. It's our advantage to use this to our advantage. Using apps, books, there's loads of books, and then they're translated into sign language. That should be what happens. There are lots of audio books, but there are no signed books to be accessed. So it's inspirational quotes. So deaf people can't access that. If they can't access the English so well, they're stuck at home and feel alone. But they should be inspired as well. There should be different ways for them to get access to this kind of inspirational language. And then there's sign language avatars. So there's not a person there, it's just technology, it's an avatar. That could be useful, a useful technology to use. So somebody to translate BSL, to have pictures, to have a visual way of accessing information. Self-care, do you? Okay, self-care. Talking about working in patients. A lot of people don't understand self-care. They don't know what that is. If they're putting on weight, they can't sleep very well. They can't self-care. I didn't know so many people who know. They know that they should exercise 30 minutes a day. They didn't know that. Which food is good, which food is bad. People get confused about that. But all of that comes from education. But then deaf people are missing out on that. So I asked people, what school did you go to as a deaf school? Oh, we did some drawing, we did some painting. It's like, really? That's not very useful. It's nice. It's nice to be creative, but what about talking about self-care? Because self-care is linked to mental well-being and keeping mentally well. So it's recognising within you that if what you're feeling, and therefore how to do something to improve that and become more positive. And aftercare, it's a big problem and very sad. As I say, working in patients, I always see patients and I see them improving, and it's really exciting to see them soon be discharged. It'd be great, well done, congratulations. And the patient says, oh, I can't wait to have my aftercare package, but they don't get anything. They don't find the right thing to match that individual. So they're told to wait, and you have to wait a bit more. And then they ask, how long? Oh, it will be there when you get home. And then they know where they're going and they feel quite comfortable to be at home, but there's nothing there to support them, so they have to be moved away from their home, and therefore they don't have that choice. They're moved, and then it becomes they're more isolated because they're moved away from where they are. Okay, sorry. So there's two choices: they stay at home without a care package, or they offer to move away and have a care package. So, yeah. So CQC, I don't know if that's possible, but maybe there's a way of finding out a budget in different regions. So a deaf person comes in, there's something already that can be given to that deaf person that comes into that region. So there's something already there. Specialist accommodation would be useful to have specialist accommodation ready for deaf people. So if they need more encouragement, more support, there's somewhere for them to go. Daycare, it would be nice to have somewhere that a person can go. So somewhere kind of local, with the provision in BSL that's accessible. At the moment there isn't anything like that. And I feel that could be a change for the next 20 years. And that's that. Thank you very much. Thank you for watching.
Thank you, Hannah. Thank you to all the presenters. And we have 15 minutes left for question-answer sessions. So when you ask questions, please come over to the front and stand where I'm standing now. So anybody wants to make a question or comment? Yes, please.
My name's James. I work with Sarah at Sign Health. I'm the Chief Executive of Sign Health, and I'm really grateful for the chance to talk about mental health and deafness today. It's what we spend all of our time talking about. I'm a bit more optimistic than some of the speakers have been today. Some of the things that people have said they want to see, I think we're in the middle of trying to achieve. We had a meeting with Samaritans recently about making Samaritans accessible for PSL users, for example. But we are talking about the future of Sign Health and what Sign Health should be doing for deaf people's health over the next 3 years. I'm talking about that with our Board of Trustees tomorrow. And our Board of Trustees is chaired by a deaf woman, has a majority of deaf trustees. But I'd be really interested to know, particularly from the speakers today, what you think the priority for Sign Health should be. Because we talked about lots of things today, we can't do everything that people have talked about today. But I'd be really interested to know what you think Sign Health should be doing more of. We are the deaf people's health charity, so it's our job amongst lots of other people's to try and resolve some of the problems that have been identified today.
Good question, thank you. So anybody wants to respond? Oh, I don't want to fall. I work, so some people might think I'm working for Sign Health, but the priority that I see is with crisis services. There's a great shortage there. Deaf people find it very difficult to access services. They can't communicate, whether it's through SMS or any other way. The services themselves are not deaf aware, they don't understand deaf people and can't communicate with them. So this really needs urgently to be improved. Paula says, and I'd just like to add, you know Glide, the video service? Deaf people use that a lot. They can sign something for a short time and then it can be just sent so easily. I think that Glide is a good way to say something quickly and to send it out as a text. Sorry, as a video. I'd like to respond to the fact that you mentioned working with a Samaritan. That really alerted me. I have a friend who is in depression, and one time she needed quickly support, and there was nothing out there. I mean, Samaritan would be perhaps perfect for hearing people to chat, but there is nothing for deaf people. It would be really critical to have something for deaf people, a helpline that they could call in a case of crisis, in a case of emergency. But there is nothing out there, and it's about time. I think that this is an urgent priority. Hello, hi James, thank you. I think that on a practical level, we should audit all the trusts, the primary care trusts, secondary care, their internet, and to see what happens when deaf people send messages, what happens and where are the gaps. We know the services are out there, but the information might not be commensurate to what's happening out there in the services, and we will identify the gaps by doing an audit. Are you okay, Jane? I've got 6 questions. Just kidding. I just want to ask Jean Cromwell, in your early presentation. It was lovely and clear, and it was interesting because you talked about issues that weren't identified or misdiagnosed. Or are we talking about solutions, like for example, the early development of sign language? Every presenter actually has mentioned services that are existing. BDHS, the British Deaf Mental Health Society, have services out there. In the UK, we're one of the most advanced countries when it comes to mental health and deafness. So why are we failing? I mean, you're giving us some solutions, but we still haven't got it right. There are things out there, but like the sign health services or the other services in existence, are they failing? In what respect? That's my question. Sorry, I don't have a magic wand in my bag. I don't know the answer to that. It's such a massive question. It hasn't got an answer. I have a deaf friend who very often has social issues, and for that he goes to the CAB, the CAB. And of course, interpreting provision is scarce. And his view is, okay, I don't need an interpreter. I mean, he's a full BSO user. And he says, it's not I that need an interpreter, it's we need interpreter. The service provider as much as the deaf person. What a deaf person would like is just to walk in and just sign in their sign language and be understood. And the service provider is unable and totally inadequate to do that. And I think that the people providing services will be able to communicate directly with deaf people like that, then great. Someone mentioned Glide as a possible way of communicating. I love that. And it means that when a deaf person is in crisis, he can just sign away and post it to the crisis team, and the crisis team would receive the signed message, but will they understand that message? They need an interpreter. It's not deaf people who need interpreters. It's people who can't sign who need interpreters. You know what I mean? And this year, I've worked with interpreters, or as an interpreter, and I found out, you know, there is the Equality Act that says that at GPs or in all the health services, you have to make reasonable accommodation. So you go to your GP, and so you have to be following what it says in the Act and provide reasonable accommodation. But in the GP service, they have commissioned an interpreting agency and made an agreement with that agency. And when a deaf patient, well, the deaf patient can't see what kind of agreement they have made with the interpreting agency. But really, they agreed something that they could afford, and when a deaf person becomes ill and goes to the GP, says, I need an appointment, the GP goes, okay, we'll book an interpreter. Then they contact the agency, they say, please arrange for an interpreter. And then dates and times come back that are available for the interpreter to come. And maybe interpreters need to travel, maybe it's not so close, maybe it's like, you know, a long time traveling for a short appointment, and then it will be like 3 hours altogether. And so let's say they charge £95 and it's all passed on, the information goes to the circle and the agency and the GP, they go, oh, that's too expensive, no, we can't afford it. the deaf person cannot complain. There is no legal entity to argue the case for the deaf person to say to the GP that they should spend the money to pay the interpreter, and maybe for obscure, sinister reasons they are refusing to attend certain appointments. The act can't be used by the deaf person. It's a toothless document. So perhaps Sign Health could help, working with the deaf community, to just turn up at the GP and sign, and then say, the problem is with you, doctors who can't sign. The problem is not with me, deaf person, using BSL, but it's with you. You need an interpreter. So far they haven't faced the problem, and they're kind of discussing in high places about provision they can't afford for being signed with interpreters. All right, thank you for your question, thank you for the answer. We have very short time for very few questions or comments. Okay. We'll try and squeeze through 4 people. Oh. Sorry, I didn't see you. Oh, it's been so interesting what I hear, but also it makes me angry.
Something like that over time. So there's 2 reasons. So what's happening? There's been cuts and cuts and cuts. Money has gone down and down and down. So recently, the United Nations, the UN, doing human rights, they're visited here. And looking into the situation of deaf people in Britain, what the situation is, and they're preparing a report that says the British government have failed disabled people, which includes deaf people. So the government are failing us. So we're talking about how to make improvements to services. Before, services were better than they are now, I feel. I don't know about you. I don't know if you agree or disagree. But I feel I've been a social worker for 40 plus years, and I've worked in deaf mental health in Birmingham, and I feel we've got good services. They need to get better. They do need to get better, but they're not bad. They're improving. They were improving, and now they're going downhill again because of the cuts. So what do we do about that? So we can talk and talk and talk, but that situation will continue.
Thank you.
The question is, I guess, what do you do?
Thank you. Anyone wants to respond to that comment? Herbert, come on. Well, looking at the cut, let's go back to thinking we're like on the lower rungs of the ladder, and there are people higher up, the CQC, the commissioning authority, etc. What do they know about deaf people? I think that deaf people should be involved at this higher level. The NHS, have researched how many people with disability work in the NHS, and actually they don't really know. They do research and they don't get the answers. What's wrong with recruiting a deaf person who would know immediately and from within the information that comes from the deaf community? I think that we're prevented from accessing these high places through kind of glass ceiling, and the boards high up who are making all these decisions, the commissioning instances, maybe we can teach them how to make savings. I mean, if they need to make cuts, maybe we can teach them how to save money. at all this symposium, and on the point of the importance of early intervention and early language acquisition and early intervention, what I'm seeing in 20 years' time, what are the priorities, and what I'm asking you, it's prevention and early diagnosis and intervention. Means it involves education and educating people right, or do we improve services in mental health? So we have to kind of see, do we prioritize prevention versus treating patients when they are in crisis? What do people think? In 20 years' time, is prevention going to be, well, I believe both are so important, are as important as each other. Now, James. I'm sure that the services will grow and that there'll be several more teams providing the service. Let's say we have like 500 services in place in 20 years' time. But I can empathize with what Ashley was saying. My dream, in all the thing, you know, the politics and all that set aside, it might not be 20 years, but 100 years to come. But everybody comes around with different needs, and there's a great diversity of situation and needs, and I don't want to put blame and figure, but what I'd imagine in the future is that someone could just go through a scan and there would be a list of exactly what's needed to be provided. Maybe in 10 years' time. I could have, you know, a special kind of card that would completely inform whether I need the police or the doctor or whatever, all the information they need to know about, but there's no leaflet about that. Yeah, but all these leaflets, what a waste of money and time. You know, maybe just a kind of a card that, once you show it, gives all the information that needs to be known by service providers. Okay, any more questions? Sorry, I need to leave. Somebody needs to catch the train. Oh, Jim has to go home. So we'll say bye. Thank you, Jim. And we have to finish at 6, but you can just say what you want to say. All the discussions on mental health, whether we talk about UK or abroad, what we're receiving through the media is also a reflection on how we understand ourselves. And what is shown in film and in the media sometimes include difficult topics, including mental health questions. Would there be some way to communicate this better, to kind of rewrite the script? Is there something missing? You know, when someone is making a film and say, oh, I'd like to make a film about this and that, and someone works in mental health, is there a disconnect between those who are working in mental health services and artists or the film and the technology area, where we could actually bridge that gap and make the creative world useful in becoming almost a tool for information on these sensitive issues? I'd like to respond. Last Thursday we had a debate with 5 panelists who talked about their experience of as service users. was 1,300 views on Facebook about the webcast that was being streamed.
Yeah.
This was such a huge awareness event as such, as it were. Yeah, a bit like the Child show, where they talk about relationship problems, etc. But for deaf people, this was like an opportunity, a rare opportunity to share, to be open, and then other people realized that they were not alone in their difficulty in managing their depression, and more people understood what mental health meant, so it was really useful. I am very, very sorry, but we have to stop. We overrunning already. It's wonderful to have had this opportunity to start. Keep going. Go to the cafe. Continue the discussion. Continue talking about this. Don't think that this is the end of the debate. This is the beginning. We have here the chief executive of Sign Health. We have such eminent doctors here. Thank you all for coming. And I hope that you will go and see the play 4.48 Psychosis. And can the presentations be posted? We can talk about this afterwards. Lovely to see you. Safe way home. Thank you. Bye bye.